Some learning objectives. Oh, goodness. Okay, sorry. I'm slow on the uptick with the technology. So some learning objectives for tonight. At the completion of this activity, you'll be able to identify different forms of electronic cigarettes and vaping devices used to deliver nicotine. You'll be able to recall key educational messages that pharmacists can use to educate both adult and adolescent patients related to the dangers of vaping, and also recognize laws and regulations surrounding the e-cigarette and vaping industry. So to kick us off, I just want to kind of get you guys thinking about vaping. And so we're going to work through some pre and post questions. We'll go through these also at the end. But which of the following is an example of an open vaping system? A, an e-hookah, B, JUUL, C, CBD oil, or D, a smoke nord? Next, pre-question is, an adolescent girl and her father approach the pharmacy counter. Dad asks the pharmacist for advice on how to get her daughter to stop vaping. He confides in you that she is given into peer pressure and she and her friends have been buying JUUL pods at school and refills a JUUL device. He isn't sure how often she is using it and she offers really no information for us. Which key educational message would be best used to educate this patient and her dad? A, using the JUUL device can lead to death. B, the JUUL pods you've been using may contain nicotine, which can affect your developing brain. C, the JUUL system you're using is the safest on the market and okay to continue. Or D, your use of nicotine at a young age increases the risk of abusing street drugs later in life. And our last pre-test question, which of the following is true about purchasing electronic cigarettes? A, a valid driver's license must be presented and reviewed. B, no form of identification is required. C, electronic cigarettes are available in vending machines. Or D, any type of flavoring pod is available. So let's start with some terminology. An e-cig or e-cig basically is going to stand for electronic cigarette. E-liquid or e-juice is really the flavoring liquids that patients use to fill e-cigarettes to produce vapor. A lung hit is inhaling vapor directly into the lungs. A mouth hit is drawing vapor from an e-cigarette into the mouth before either inhaling it into the lungs or blowing it back out. And then a throat hit is a draw that causes tingling in the back of the throat, which is usually associated with inhaling higher levels of nicotine. Other terminology that you'll hear are ENDS, or electronic nicotine delivery systems. These are products that produce an aerosolized mixture containing flavored liquids and nicotine that is inhaled by the user. There are multiple products available, so you'll see the examples on this slide. They include e-cigarettes and even a product called JUUL. E-cigarettes can resemble traditional tobacco products like cigarettes, cigars, pipes, or common gadgets, even like flashlights, flash drives, or even pens. This slide looks at how the e-cigarette has evolved over time. So as you can see, they started off actually looking like a real cigarette. Then they kind of looked like a pen. Then the box mod was popular, but now they can be made to look almost like a USB thumb drive, such as the vape pod. So this slide highlights a vape pod with its compact design. Some would argue that they're, being made to be concealed, but they come with pre-filled pods or cartridges for one-time use, or some of them can be bought with refillable cartridges. So this slide basically has the components of a vaping device. And so the components are going to be the liquid supply, like we've talked about. You need a heater to heat the liquid material to a temperature that's sufficient to vaporize it and form an aerosol. There's a wick between the liquid and the heater. There'll be at least one air inlet to deliver air to a central air passage upstream of the heater. There'll be a mouthpiece and then a battery. So really, e-cigarettes are electronic devices that use a battery to aerosolize a liquid, usually containing nicotine, flavoring, and other additives, which is inhaled by the user through a mouthpiece. And so patients can also use these to deliver marijuana or other substances as well. There's an extreme variety of devices, substances, and even practices available for these types of devices. We generally think of them in two types of systems. It's going to be either a closed system, so one that has self-containing e-liquid. Examples include cartridges and pods. And an example of that would be like the JUUL device, and these are not meant for modification. They're also not reusable, so patients should not try to refill them, open them up, and put their own liquid in them really at all. Also, interestingly, they're not recyclable. The other type is an open system, and these can be modified. So patients can build, rebuild, or modify their components. These can be refilled, and as such, patients will insert a range of e-liquids for their personal use. So let's talk about these e-liquids next. What patients add to their open systems becomes important as we talk later about the detrimental effects that can have been seen that cause harm to the lungs. Most patients that I've talked to discuss how they use a base for their liquid, which they typically buy in bulk. A lot of my patients talk about how they buy propylene glycol like on Amazon, and then they add additives. So patients are adding things like nicotine, CBD oil, hemp oil, cannabis, and other flavorings. And I have heard some patients even talk about adding alcohol to their vape system. Now, I do want to point out that the manufacturers of open systems caution patients to not vape like common household vegetable oil, corn syrup, coconut oil, or other cooking oils. So when I think of the vape industry, it's hard for me to not think, quote, big tobacco, right? We know these manufacturers have lobbyists, and there's a fear of political backlash in tobacco-friendly states, which can lead to bureaucratic delays. The US has the largest vape market, followed by the United Kingdom and France. So folks from these three countries alone spent more than $10 billion on smokeless tobacco and vaping products in 2018. It's also kind of interesting to think about it, but this industry really has its own verb, right? Vaping. It's kind of hard to come up with other examples of that. I was thinking about that the other day. Really, the only good one I can come up with would be like Googling, I guess. So I think that's kind of interesting. To date, we're dealing with a largely unregulated smokeless tobacco market. I realize that lung injury from vaping has really fallen out of the spotlight, probably for a number of reasons. The main one is probably the current pandemic, but the risk of lung injury may be dependent on this unregulated market. And so that can include things like factors in the supply chain, the delivery device, inhalation practices of the user, and the medical vulnerability of the user, as well as other variables. And so where does the United States get its vape supply? Actually, the vast majority of our vaping products come from China. So patients and I will sometimes try to estimate how much nicotine they're getting from the e-cigarette or their vape pod. And I usually respond kind of generally with, well, it's really hard to know. And that's because, we know electronic cigarettes are designed to deliver nicotine, but the nicotine content can be high, often higher than combustible cigarettes, and it really varies among products. The JUUL design of the pods is really only to be allowing 0.7 mils of juice in each pod, and then they say it's either 5% or 3% nicotine by weight. Other brands, I've seen quoted that like 300 puffs of the e-cigarette aerosol contains between 21 to 85% of the total nicotine content of that cartridge. And then other information, I've found that some studies have found discrepancies between what's labeled and then the measured nicotine content as well. So like I said, it's really hard to kind of know how much people are actually getting when they're using these products. Now, we also know tobacco product nicotine exposure and pharmacokinetics is really dependent on the delivery system, the pH of the tobacco, as well as the pH of the smoke. But remember, electronic cigarettes don't produce a combustible smoke. They deliver an aerosol containing nicotine and other tobacco-related compounds. And so the temperature at which the e-liquid is aerosolized is going to have a direct effect on the nicotine yield. And it's thought that the higher the temperature, you're going to get more nicotine in your aerosol. And so also, you know, thinking about that, the design of the system may also affect how much nicotine a patient is getting. And so we know that with traditional cigarettes, inhaling nicotine from tobacco smoke is easy. Nicotine will reach receptors in the brain, you know, typically within seconds. We also know that the typical cigarette contains between 0.5 and 1 milligram of nicotine. And so that's why it's usually kind of easy for us to estimate that if people smoke about a pack a day, they're probably getting about 20 milligrams of nicotine per day. We also know a reliable way of obtaining nicotine is through nicotine replacement products like the patch, gum, the lozenge. Although they have a slower absorption, we know nicotine will routinely make it to those receptors. The nicotine from vape systems, it's still relatively unknown. There isn't a lot of data to compare traditional cigarettes to. It is postulated that when vaping, nicotine is being delivered both buccally and through the lung, but differences in products' nicotine content and design features really makes it hard to compare across products. You're really kind of looking at apples to oranges. So I want to take you through a brief timeline regarding the use of electronic cigarettes. It's actually thought that they were, quote, invented by a Chinese pharmacist in 2003 in China. We saw the popularity rise in Europe in 2006, and that's about when they were introduced into the United States market. Because of the soar in popularity, the World Health Organization at that time put out a statement in 2008 that basically said, you know, these are really not helpful for helping people quit smoking. By 2015, JUUL Labs debuted a discrete USB-sized vaporizer, and the popularity really took off. So we see a spike in vaping, especially amongst adolescents and young adults. And then in the fall of 2019, thousands of patients end up hospitalized due to severe lung illnesses, and 47 people died. In 2009, President Obama signed into law the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Act, which gave the FDA the power to regulate the tobacco industry. And this was over a decade ago, okay? So although nicotine and cartridges, nicotine and cigarettes as a whole can't be banned outright, flavoring such as fruit or like a mint flavor can. Additionally, new tobacco products seeking to enter the market will now be required to meet FDA pre-market standards, which could affect electronic cigarette regulation. In that same year, California attempted to create a law banning the sale of e-cigarettes throughout the state. Interestingly, Governor Schwarzenegger at the time vetoed the bill, stating if adults want to purchase and consume these products with an understanding of the associated health risks, they should be able to do so unless and until federal law changes the legal status of these tobacco products. In 2013, a group of senators, including Dick Durbin from Illinois, sent a letter to the FDA, urging the FDA to issue deeming regulations to exert regulatory authority over cigars, pipe tobacco, electronic cigarettes, and dissolvable tobacco products. Later that year, a letter from several representatives was also sent to the FDA. In 2016, President Obama signed the Child Nicotine Poisoning Prevention Act, and that required the packaging of liquid nicotine containers to be subject to existing child poisoning prevention packaging standards. In 2016, the FDA's foundational, quote, deeming rule went into effect. So that actually gave the agency's Center for Tobacco Products regulatory authority over all ENDS, and that included electronic cigarettes, vapes, e-liquids, e-cigars, e-pipes, and e-hookahs. So under this ruling, the FDA can evaluate certain issues, including ingredients, product features, and health risks, as well as their appeal to minors and non-users. The FDA rule also bans access to minors. So now a photo ID is required to buy electronic cigarettes, and their sale in all ages vending machines is not permitted in the United States. And it's kind of funny, my daughter did a science project on vaping last spring, and we went to Quick Trip to buy a vape. We went to get JUUL particularly, and they wouldn't even let me buy it at Quick Trip without an ID. I had to go back to the car to get my driver's license to purchase, which I thought was actually pretty cool. But because this is still a relatively new law, the FDA is still working to enact policies and procedures related to the regulation of these products. So last year, when we saw a surge in these lung-related illnesses, many local and state jurisdictions began to enact laws that prohibit e-cigarette usage everywhere. That smoking is banned, although some state laws with comprehensive smoke-free laws will still allow for vaping to be permitted in bars and restaurants, while prohibiting e-cigarette use in other indoor places. So San Francisco, for example, has completely banned e-cigarette and vaping product sales throughout their city. So you can't even buy it, any of the products in San Francisco. Closer to home, Governor J.B. Pritzker in Illinois signed a bill in April of 2019 that raised the legal age for purchasing cigarettes, e-cigarettes, and other tobacco products from 18 to 21 statewide in Illinois. And we'll talk more about that age to purchase a little bit later. And then also to note, North Carolina's Attorney General is suing 8 companies that sell vaping products. His office is actually accusing the companies of aggressively targeting children and do not require appropriate age verification when selling these dangerous and addictive products. So what else is happening at the federal level? Well, as previously discussed, in 2016, that deeming rule went into effect, and that granted the Center for Tobacco Products regulatory authority over all forms of nicotine, including electronic cigarette products. These companies were given time to submit new drug applications or NDAs to the FDA, like any new drug. In 2019, unfortunately, the FDA commissioner granted them another 4-year reprieve from doing so. However, that was actually blocked by a federal judge. And so they have ordered the FDA, this judge did, to require that these e-cigarette companies do go ahead and apply for these NDAs, and they gave them a deadline of May of 2020. Now, unfortunately, because of COVID, it appears that that has also been extended. So the FDA is working towards getting all flavors of e-cigarettes, including mint, fruit, and dessert flavors, banned. And so the only ones really that will be available are menthol or tobacco flavor. And they think that this will hopefully help deter young patients. So, you know, what is it that we kind of worry about if all these flavors are banned? I mean, I personally worry that like patients will start creating their own e-liquids more and more with like the flavors that they want, or patients will go to like the black market to buy them. And then patients can technically add THC to open systems. When it comes to THC, the law is a little unclear because it's still federally illegal, marijuana is, but 11 states, including Missouri and Illinois, have legalized it in some way, making it probably easier for our patients to obtain and use. And then, like I mentioned earlier about J.B. Pritzker raising the legal age of buying nicotine products, President Trump actually signed a law, legislation in December of 2019 that did the same thing. So he actually raised the federal minimum age of to sell or to buy tobacco products from 18 to 21. So it's actually now illegal for a retailer to sell any tobacco containing product, including cigarettes, cigars, and e-cigarettes, to anyone under the age of 21. So we briefly talked about the new drug applications that were due back in May, but due to COVID, this has been extended. But I did want to kind of point out that so JUUL Labs is actually planning on what they're calling an age-locked e-cigarette that they're going to apply for. And so apparently the device is going to be locked, and the way that they can unlock it is the user is going to have to connect through a Bluetooth connection to an app that will somehow require proof of the correct age. JUUL also plans to submit materials with their NDAs that their e-cigarettes are, quote, safer than traditional cigarettes. So we'll all have to kind of, you know, wait to see what they come up with. And then I also just wanted to point out, you know, don't forget about taxes. So several states have higher taxes than others. For example, it's quite common for Illinois residents to cross into Missouri now to buy their cigarettes because they're much cheaper. You know, the same thing is probably true for gas. So it's estimated that the number of adults who vape will reach nearly 55 million by 2021. As previously mentioned, e-cigarettes can resemble traditional tobacco products like cigarettes, cigars, pipes, or common gadgets, even like flashlights, flash drives, or even pens. And that can make them pretty easy to hide from parents or caregivers. I mean, if I found this in my daughter's backpack, I don't know that I would necessarily question it. I would probably just assume it was like a USB drive. These products have grown rapidly, particularly among the youth and young adults. Youth use of e-cigarettes is definitely a significant public health concern. E-cigarettes are the most commonly used tobacco products among youth, and it's rising really at an alarming rate. In 2018, 21% of high school students and 5% of middle school students reported having used e-cigarettes in the last 30 days. It's also postulated that e-cigarette use grew 78% among high schoolers and 48% among middle schoolers in just 1 year, from 2017 to 2018. It's also thought that JUUL, the product JUUL, is now accounting for more than 75% or 3/4 of the entire e-cigarette market. So it definitely does seem like JUUL is everywhere. In 2018, the Surgeon General actually declared that e-cigarette use among youth is an epidemic and that aggressive steps must be taken to protect our kids from nicotine addiction and other associated health risks from e-cigarettes. A little bit more recent data in 2019, the National Youth Tobacco Survey on e-cigarette use showed that more than 5 million U.S. middle and high school students are current e-cigarette users. That meant that they'd used one at least in the past 30 days. And the majority report cartridge-based products as their usual one of choice. And the students cite the availability of appealing flavors as the primary reason for their use. So probably what's scariest for me is that vaping among youth increases the likelihood that they will go on to use regular combustible cigarettes or other tobacco products. So, this emphasizes the point really that even if it's not desired, or, that kids don't realize that it could happen, nicotine addiction is definitely possible when they use a vape. Now, how often are kids using marijuana in their vapes? It's really unclear how many teens are putting THC in their open vape systems, but according to national survey data, the use is on the rise. Remember, this practice is not recommended or regulated, and doing so could increase the likelihood of other harmful substances getting into the lung. Also, combining e-liquids could be dangerous as well. So if they're, using a bunch of bases, they've got their propylene glycol, they've got their flavoring, they've got nicotine, they've got marijuana, and they're putting that all into their open system, that could be super dangerous. So as you can see from this slide, the adolescent and teen market is huge for these vape manufacturers, right? They target them in retail stores, internet sites, TV ads, and definitely push them on social media. And then you can kind of see from like the picture at the top left on the slide that flavoring ads are really meant to mimic sweets or foods that these kids are accustomed to, right? So like it looks kind of like a Cool Whip or Sour Patch Kids kind of things that students or that kids kind of associate with, a good flavoring or a good taste. There are adverse effects that we know. So some known adverse effects from vaping include vapor's tongue, and that's actually a temporary dulling of the sense of taste. This usually follows intense vaping sessions. So like they vape, a lot in a small amount of time, or vaping the same flavor for long periods of time. Other adverse effects that really come to light, last fall, that was EVALI, or e-cigarette or vaping product use associated lung injury. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So, the evolution of EVALI, how did we get here? In early August of 2019, the FDA issued a statement saying that it had received 127 reports of seizures or other neurological symptoms. So patients were like fainting or they had weird tremors, and that those episodes occurred after vaping between the years of 2010 and 2019. It was happening so frequently in August that the CDC actually opened a probe into these vaping-related lung disease kind of issues. And then state and federal officials that teamed up to explore whether e-cigarettes were causing some of these severe pulmonary issues in 153 people. August 19th, state and federal health officials reported that 153 people across 16 states had been treated for respiratory illnesses after vaping. And then a few days later, closer to home, the Illinois Department of Health reported that we had a patient in Illinois basically died after vaping. August 30th in 2019, the CDC came out with a pretty bold statement that just said, you know, stop buying vaping products off the street, don't modify any kind of product. In September 4th, so a few days later, there was a vaping-related death reported in Oregon, and I think that was the first one that they identified it was potentially like THC induced, that he had put THC in the vape. The next day, there was another death in Indiana, and so forth. So, you know, the death number, the cases continued to rise. Actually, at the end of September in 2019, the JUUL CEO actually stepped down and the company ceased all US advertising. But by the end of that month, there were already 12 known deaths. And that continued throughout the fall last year. As of February of 2020, there were over close to 3,000 hospitalized cases, a case in every state, including Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands and Washington, D.C. The majority of patients, almost, you know, 3/4 of the patients were less than 35 years old, 82% reporting using THC-containing products in their vape, 14% reported using only nicotine-containing products, and then there were 68 deaths. Missouri had 2. So, you know, kind of what the physicians learned, what clinicians learned over time, the symptoms that were associated with EVALI, 95% of the cases patients had, you know, like lung complaints. So cough, chest pain, shortness of breath. 85% had a fever, chills, and weight loss. 77% had abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. About half of the patients had a low O2 sat on room air. And then actually almost 1/4 of patients required intubation. 55% were tachycardic and 45% were tachypnic upon presentation. And so really, you know, they kind of came to learn that it was a diagnosis of exclusion. And so the CDC recommended like viral respiratory panels, an influenza screen, you know, work them up for community acquired pneumonia. And they really wanted, you know, patients to be given like a really good social history. So, you know, asking about e-cigarette use, are you using vape products in the last 90 days? You know, what was it? How much did you do it? Did you modify it? Where did you buy it? Kind of things like that. And then also, you know, looking at like a chest x-ray or a chest CT. And so, you know, what really causes EVALI? Unfortunately, researchers and clinicians were not 100% positive. You know, for a while, they thought it was the THC that folks were adding to their open systems. Then they thought it was the vitamin E additive. You know, we're still not 100% certain. We think it could potentially have been like ultrafine particulate matter in the solution or volatile organic compounds. There could have been contaminants like heavy metals or even bacteria or fungal toxins in any really of those products that they put in the e-liquid. You know, it could have been the nicotine or the flavorings that folks added as well. So just as I mentioned, we thought vitamin E was a potential cause, and it still is, per CDC, quote, strongly linked to EVALI. As 29 of 29 EVALI patients had vitamin E in their bronchial alveolar lavage fluid. The New England Journal published an article also looking at vitamin E acetate in the bronchial alveolar lavage fluid associated with EVALI, and found it in all but 3 of the patients. But vitamin E was not found in any of the healthy volunteer comparator bronchial alveolar lavage fluid. So it really, you know, confirmed for us that that's definitely not a substance found in a healthy lung. And then the 3 patients who did not have vitamin E acetate in their BAL fluid also ended up really not having a EVALI diagnosis on discharge. I think one was admitted for like a multi-drug overdose. One was later tested and found positive for a different bacteria, and then one grew MRSA from culture. And so we know from previous studies that vitamin E can induce inflammation in the lung. It's also been shown to increase eosinophils and airway hyperresponsiveness in studies of patients with asthma. And then other known pulmonary toxins that was detected, one patient had limonene and then one had coconut oil in their bronchoalveolar lavage fluid. Other additives that were most commonly discussed as a potential inducer of EVALI is marijuana, so THC. At this time, we don't really have enough information to rule out non-THC products or really rule out products that were obtained legitimately. So it's just really hard to know, where patients were getting their supply, what they were really doing with it when they added it to the liquid. It's just still kind of up in the air. How are patients treated? It's really, they were, kind of basing their treatment on expert opinion and then some case series, but really empiric antibiotics, if patients came in with those symptoms, they would try to cover for community-acquired pneumonia, again, based on patient-specific factors, and then de-escalate those antibiotics once pneumonia was ruled out. Corticosteroids were a little controversial, if you guys remember from last fall. They were to be used with extreme caution, and really they were only indicated in patients that were admitted. So if it was a patient being treated for EVALI in the outpatient setting, you were to avoid corticosteroids, but patients that were hospitalized, they definitely showed rapid improvement with typically like IV methylprednisolone 40 to 60 milligrams 3 to 4 times a day. And then once the patient became stable, they wanted to be transitioned to oral steroids. Mechanical ventilation was actually used in about 1/3 of the hospitalized cases. And then, many of the case reports that have been published really talk about how the experts were really just treating a lot of these patients kind of like they had acute respiratory distress syndrome, and that seemed to help. On discharge planning, patients were, needed to have a stable O2 sat. They needed to have adequate exercise tolerance for at least 1 to 2 days before they could go home. Their vital signs, physical exam symptoms, and lab needed to return to baseline. Before they get discharged, you want to make sure they have a PCP follow-up within at least 48 hours. Typically would have them follow up with a pulmonologist at 2 to 4 weeks and then at 1 to 2 months. They needed written guidance on when to seek help. So hopefully in the written guidance, it also said, don't go home and vape. But really, pharmacist counseling on discharge meds was actually noted in the discharge planning guidance from the CDC. And that really, kind of honed in or was special for me because it was really, making us realize that pharmacists are essential in ensuring patients are, not readmitted due to confusion or non-compliance with discharge meds. Patients should have, been potentially referred to social work or case management if there were risks associated with that. And then, like I said earlier, hopefully emphasizing like cessation of using the vaping devices. There were, however, some patients that were readmitted from going home and basically, vaping the same thing again. So if you have an EVALI patient, we're still, trying to remind folks to report it to the FDA. So the CDC and the FDA report that cases are declining, which is, encouraging, but we're hoping that's due to increased awareness. However, it could be because of a decrease in reporting. So it's just important to remember to continue to do that. And they have a spot to do that on their website. So at follow-up, the risk of recurrence is really not known. Like I mentioned, some patients were admitted or readmitted with similar symptoms because they, didn't stop. but many of the patient's symptoms resolved. Like I said, some patients relapsed during the steroid taper or because they started vaping again. If patients had persistent hypoxemia, they required home oxygen. And then making sure that we were educating patients, definitely call or come back, quickly if symptoms redeveloped. It was shown that the groups that were especially high risk were those that were older age, so patients greater than 50. I think earlier in the slide I said, almost 75% of the patients were less than 37. And so if you were greater than 50, you were definitely at higher risk. They had a higher percentage of intubation seen in those patients greater than 50. And they also had a long mean inpatient stay of approximately 15 days. Other groups that were at high risk was if you had a history of cardiac disease or a history of lung disease, including asthma or COPD, and then patients that were pregnant. So what are additional risks of EVALI? It's also probably too soon to know if patients with these lung injuries from vaping will go on to sustain further lung diseases or fully recover. Who knows if they're going to go on to develop lung cancer or COPD in the future. It's really just kind of not known at this time. Other risks include the heating coils can get hot enough to melt particles that can be inhaled. Also, batteries have gotten so hot that they've caused burns or kind of like exploded in patients' faces. And the liquid can be toxic, especially in like a pediatric population if they were to like lick it, touch it, try to drink it, kind of things like that. So, kind of this leads me to, should we be taking better like social histories? And I would say yes. I mean, we should be asking patients about vaping products, what they're inhaling, the frequency of use. We should be asking if they've experienced any adverse effects from their e-cigarettes or vaping products and devices. So, have you noticed any increase in shortness of breath or problems breathing, chest pain, kind of things like that. Can e-cigarettes and vaping help current smokers quit? As someone who spent almost 20 years at my practice site, where I spend a considerable amount of time helping patients try to quit smoking, I would really love to say, yes, use this instead of traditional cigarettes for sure. And that's because we know, right, the devastating impact of combustible cigarettes on the public health. Almost 480,000 deaths per year in the US are from tobacco-associated cancers, emphysema, heart disease, and stroke. And we have so many patients that despite knowing it's terrible for them, they just cannot quit. I can't tell you how many patients I've worked with over the years that have had like a lobectomy because of lung cancer, but yet they continue to light up every day. So, in any product in my arsenal that could diminish the use of traditional cigarettes should be considered of an enormous, potential value. Are e-cigarettes that product? It's probably complicated. I will tell you the majority of my patients that I work with that use electronic cigarettes actually continue to smoke combustible cigarettes as well. So for me, the answer is really not clear. There are some data, both epidemiological and from direct clinical trials, that some e-cigarettes can reduce the use of combustible cigarette use and may be less harmful than traditional cigarettes. But for all that data, you can find data that says the opposite. So other data can tell us that they're not safe alternatives to smoking cigarettes. Generally, my message is, yes, the FDA now has regulatory authority over these products. Has it made manufacturers prove to them that what they state is on the label is actually contained in their product? Not yet, at least not to my knowledge. So I like to stick to my old standbys, okay? Chantix, bupropion, nicotine patch, gum, nicotine lozenge. If patients want to use these along with nicotine replacement products or to try to taper, I generally remind them of the risks, okay? But also, it's sometimes just good to like remind patients, your goal with quitting smoking is to eventually become smoke-free and nicotine-free, and that's not happening if you continue to vape. And we have had patients that have become addicted to vaping, obviously, because they're getting nicotine from a different source, and then that can be, another problem altogether. So when talking to patients about these products, I always recommend, or I always remind them, don't forget there's actually stuff in the liquid beyond just your nicotine. Okay, so besides nicotine, e-cigarettes can contain harmful ingredients, including ultrafine particles that can be inhaled deep into the lungs. They have flavorants like diacetyl, a chemical linked to lung injury, volatile organic compounds, heavy metals, and that can include nickel, tin, chromium, and lead. I mean, a lot of times if patients hear those words and they kind of think through that, they're thinking, I'm inhaling lead down into my lungs? Yes, you are. And the aerosol that's created when an e-cigarette heats up the e-liquid, it's not just water vapor, and it's not harmless either for both themselves or for people around them that are getting it secondhand. So besides nicotine, which is harmful to young people's health on its own if they're getting it secondhand, heavy metals that can cause respiratory distress and disease have been found in the e-cigarette aerosol. Chemicals that are known to cause some cancers and that have been linked to lung disease are also sometimes present in e-cigarette aerosol. And then also, I would definitely not recommend any of these products to pregnant women. So that's kind of like how I focus my education for adults. It's a little bit different for teens and kids. And when I'm talking to a teen or a kid or a parent about their child, really I kind of hone in on, vaping products often contain nicotine, which is an addictive substance. And so sometimes kids, they don't realize that. And then also I like to kind of explain that like your brain in kids and teens, they're still developing. And generally, your brain can continue to develop until about around the age of 25. And so using nicotine during this period of adolescence and brain development can disrupt the formation of brain circuits that control attention, learning, and susceptibility to addiction. And because of this, young people are uniquely at risk for long-term effects of exposing their developing brains to nicotine. Okay, that is going to increase their risk of a mood disorder, permanent lowering of impulse control, and then I think I mentioned this earlier, but scary, e-cigarette use is strongly associated with other tobacco product use, including regular cigarettes in the future. Other things that I like to point out is, the liquid for e-cigarettes can contain high enough levels of nicotine to cause nicotine poisoning if it's ingested or absorbed through the skin. So if you've got a younger brother or a younger sister and they're going to be around your stuff and they see your vape pods and they want to touch it or lick it or eat it, that's going to be really dangerous, especially if they may be attracted to that liquid because of the flavors, or it's like in a bright packaging, or just it's a bright color, kind of things like that. And then also the battery or the heating element in the vaping devices can get extremely hot, and they've been known to cause some pretty bad burns. So what is the CDC urging patients to do? They want us to avoid vaping THC. So I usually, educate my patients like, try not to do that. They really want patients to avoid modified or buying vaping products like quote, off the street. Okay. They obviously would like patients to refrain from all vaping products if possible. They also are urging patients, try not to return to smoking cigarette, but really, consider an FDA approved smoking cessation option like nicotine patch, gum, lozenge, bupropion, Chantix, things like that. And then also like monitor for these symptoms. So if you notice, something's not right, you feel different after you vaped, or you tried a different product and now you have shortness of breath or a cough or chest tightness, chest pain, kind of things like that, tell someone, let us know. When collecting a social history, kind of what can we do as pharmacists? I mean, I think we need to be asking about vaping routinely. And so that entails like, what device are you using? Are you modifying a device? So are you using an open or a closed system? If it's an open system, are you modifying it all? What substances and additives are you vaping? So are you buying a product from like a store? Or are you buying things like propylene glycol, like the food grade propylene glycol from Amazon, and then you're adding your own additives? Because patients tell me that that's much cheaper, and so that's usually why they do that. But also I like to ask them, like, where did you obtain this product? So I'm trying to get a sense of like, did you buy it off the street? Did you buy it in a store? Did you buy it, the products from Amazon, and then you're making your own mixture? how frequently are you using this? So some people will say, well, I only vape in the morning and then I smoke cigarettes the rest of the day, while other people will just say, I only vape and I vape all day long, okay? I also try to ask, like, why are you vaping? Like, are you trying to use that to try to quit smoking, or is it another reason? Do you like the flavor? You know, kind of get a sense of like why do they feel like they want to do that? I also try to assess like their willingness to quit as well. So it's like, okay, I've kind of educated you on why I think the reasons why you shouldn't be using this. What do you think? Like, are you wanting to maybe consider, you know, potentially trying to quit? And so kind of plant that seed, put a bug in their ear about, you know, your willingness to help them and you're there for assistance in the future. Risk of relapse to conventional cigarettes if vaping is stopped. So, you know, kind of making sure that they are making that association between like, let's not switch back to cigarettes. Let's try to, you know, use maybe more of like an FDA approved mechanism for trying to quit. And then, you know, if patients are illegally purchasing, modifying, or, you know, using unknown quality or unknown source, those were the kind of the patients that had a higher threat of the EVALI than if they purchase it from like a mainstream vendor. So to summarize, vaping and the use of electronic cigarettes is definitely not new, but it is gaining in popularity, especially amongst teenagers and our youth. We also now have some published analysis of clusters of patients experiencing adverse effects from vaping nicotine, but also from THC from marijuana. We also now have data directly linking deaths to the use of vaping. So when educating patients, we want to make sure they understand the risks associated with the use of electronic cigarettes and vaping devices. The use of these products may not be safe. We know that the aerosol contains heavy metals and known carcinogens, and that kids and adolescents can become addicted to nicotine, which may alter their developing brain. So with that, I want to go back to our pre-test questions. So this was the first one. Which of the following is an example of an open vaping system? A, the e-hookah, B, the JUUL, C, CBD oil, or D, the smoke nord? So I'm going to give you a couple seconds to think about that. And so the correct answer actually is A, the e-hookah. And so the JUUL and the smoke nord are both closed systems, meaning that the user buys nicotine pods that contain liquid used to vape in the device, and it's not modified. An e-hookah would be considered open, an open system, because it can be modified by the user. This can include adding homemade vape juice, CBD oil, or THC to inhale. Next question. An adolescent girl and her father approached the pharmacy counter. Dad asked the pharmacist for advice on how to get his daughter to stop vaping. He confides in you that she's given into peer pressure, and she and her friends have been buying JUUL pods at school and refills her JUUL device. He isn't sure how often she's using it, and she offers no information. So which key educational message would be best used to educate this patient and her dad? A, using the JUUL device can lead to death. B, the JUUL pods you've been using may contain nicotine, which can affect your developing brain. C, the JUUL system you're using is the safest on the market and okay to continue. And D, your use of nicotine at a young age increases the risk of abusing street drugs later in life. So I'll give you a couple seconds to think about that one. So for that one, the correct answer is actually B as in boy. JUUL pods probably contain nicotine, which can affect the developing brain of young patients, including increasing the risk of ADHD and other addictive behavior in the future. So, you know, generally pharmacists should not educate patients that JUUL is safe, and simply stating that vaping can lead to death, that's really not advice and could be considered, you know, kind of condescending. And then marijuana is actually considered the gateway drug, not nicotine. Nicotine can influence other future nicotine use, but not illegal substances. And then our last pre-test question, which of the following is true about purchasing electronic cigarettes? A, a valid driver's license must be presented and reviewed. B, no form of identification is required. C, electronic cigarettes are available in vending machines. Or D, any type of flavoring pod is available. I'll give you a couple seconds. So for that one, I think I talked about my personal experience with that, but the correct answer is actually A. So patients must show a valid ID for the seller to know their age, as they are federally prohibited to sell to a minor. They are no longer available in vending machines, as there is no way to verify age. And JUUL has stopped the sale of mint flavored pods, as these are most commonly used in adolescents. Some states have also banned the sale of certain flavors, making all products not available universally. And with that, I would like to thank everyone for your attendance, and I will entertain any questions that you have for me if you want to put it in the either the chat box or the question box. Oh, what were the 5 A's again? Okay, great question. So smoking cessation, the 5 A's are ask, assist, advise, arrange, and I can't remember the other one. Let me think about that. Ask, advise, assess. So it's like ask if they want to quit, assess their willingness to quit, advise them to quit, arrange follow up, and I'm so sorry, I cannot come up with the 5th one. Let's see. Has there been any data published yet regarding vaping and increased death or complications from COVID? That's a really good question. So if you didn't hear me, the question was, has there been anything associated with vaping and COVID-19? I actually haven't seen anything to date about that. Like I said earlier, I just feel like the pandemic has kind of really kind of tramped down this topic a lot. So no, I haven't seen anything about the combo. I can't imagine if you had EVALI, I can't imagine getting COVID would be enjoyable. Oh, ask, advise, assess, assist, and arrange. Okay, yeah, great, thank you. I can't remember which one I missed. I think I missed assist. I don't know. Anyway, great, thanks. We did a good job teaching you. Thank you, Dr. Stacy. Okay, let's see. I'm curious as to why vape products are lumped in with tobacco instead. I can't read the rest of your comment. So why they're lumped in with tobacco? Are you trying to ask like why? I'm assuming you're asking like why they're lumped in with tobacco with the FDA, maybe? I think it's just because like in general, none of the products really have been FDA approved or even like regulated. And so now because of that deeming rule, they are going to be able to be more regulated. Are there any laws prohibiting vaping indoors? That is a really, really good question. I think that if it's no smoking inside, I'm pretty sure that means no vaping. I know there's a federal mandate that you can't vape like on a plane, similar to no smoking on a plane. But as far as like restaurants and bars and things like that, I don't know that I've actually seen anything specific to vaping. That's a really good question. Any other questions? Are there any support groups for vaping? That's a really good question too. Not that I've ever seen, but I bet if we Googled it, we could probably find one. But no, I haven't referred any of my patients to like a support group, but that's a good point.